water. Thank you, Dr. Navarro. That's a major address with many points, some newsworthy, some, to use a cliche, food for thought for the long term. Why don't I try to pick up on 2 or 3 of your major themes and draw you out about how we could have success in what I take to be your major challenge, how to go from useful idiot to national unity. And the first question I'd ask you in that regard is I think that Ronald Reagan, President Donald Trump, you and me all have something very unusual in common about our politics. All 4 of us were once Democrats. As I read about you in the New York Times, you ran at least 4 times as a Democrat in San Diego. I was actually a registered Democrat and ran for the Democratic National Convention in 1976 to support Senator Henry Jackson, a kind of hawk on the Soviet Union. So there may be hope for useful idiots and Democrats to change their minds about China and not be the kind of force that serves China's interests in our country that you're talking about. So the question would be, how do you visualize this process going forward? Where some of the examples you gave of the NBA or Hollywood producers, or I still stuck on the word craven. You used the word craven, useful idiots.
Yeah.
How could some of, obviously financial Wall Street investment firms are deeply committed to China. How do you visualize these people as a group shifting the way we all did from being Democratic Party members? When I say we, I mean Trump, Reagan, Navarro, and Pillsbury, and many millions of others. How could this shift take place? Because one possibility is Chinese behavior is going to be more and more extreme. And so it'll just become impossible for the friends of China, as the Chinese themselves call it, it'll become impossible for the friends of China inside our country to continue to be useful idiots. So could Chinese conduct getting worse be one of the factors that changes all this? Because I noticed you did say in the beginning that despite all that President Trump has done, China is still continuing, even getting, I think you used the word, more emboldened than before. So this implies to me we're going to have not only national unity and the conversion of the useful idiots, we're also going to have stronger measures going forward to try to change Chinese behavior. Is this possible? Do you think both of us are being too optimistic that China will ever stop? Are we looking at the next leader of the world and there's not much we can do about it?
Well, let's, the theme here is that we as a country have to unify around a common threat from outside our borders. Mm-hmm. We used to have a tradition in this country, in our political system, that politics stopped at the border. That when it came to foreign conflicts, foreign tensions, that we united as a country. When I talk about unity, we have to be clear-eyed about this. We as a country are never going to be unified about a lot of things. There are things like choice versus life. There are things like the right to bear arms versus gun control. Mm-hmm. There's big government versus small government. These are issues as to why we have elections, and that's a good and powerful thing. But what's happened is in the partisan fight over these primarily domestic issues, we've lost sight of this broader threat. One might even say existential threat that's bearing down on us. And so what I'm trying to do today here is raise awareness that a lot of what's happening for partisan reasons in the mainstream media, in professional sports, in Hollywood, in Silicon Valley, on Wall Street, is unwittingly dividing this nation in a way which advances the Chinese Communist Party's agenda. And the hope here, and it's the triumph of hope over experience, because we are where we are. The hope here is that people in America, in our elite institutions, will finally wrap their head around the dangers. I mean, I come from a university environment, right? For years, I watched the Chinese money flood in to academia for two purposes. One, to advance the Chinese narrative, and two, steal our treasures. And yet that money just kept coming in. So anyway, that's my thought. It's like, I think, seek truth from facts. And what I'm trying to do is put out some facts here and hope that we get to the truth and therefore political change. But, it's like, it's a tough slog here.
Well, I want to pick up on one word you used. I think it's an adverb. Unwittingly.
Unwittingly. Yes. Yeah.
That it's not as though the useful idiots or those who serve China's interests in our country have necessarily thought things through thoroughly, read all of your books and all of my books, and then made a conscious decision, I'm going to work for China. When you say unwittingly, it implies that the role of education could be important going forward. So I wanted to get your reaction to some developments that I think are very positive. Hudson is not the only think tank that's become deeply interested in the China problem. We have a brother-sister think tank, which I really admire what they've been doing recently in the last couple of years. It's called Center for New American Security. And a lot of Vice President Biden's advisors sort of come out of there. They've issued a number of really strong reports on the China problem. They even call it the total competitive threat. There's another set of activities going on in the Congress. About a month ago, the New York Times had a long article on 7 senators, all Democrats, who put forward a 10-year program, $350 billion total amount of money. Senator Menendez of New Jersey on foreign relations was in the lead. They tended to be the ranking Democrats on the top 6 committees in the Senate. And I read through this proposal. It's actually a piece of legislation. It's very detailed. It has many of the points you're making today, and some others as well. They want to train journalists, for example, to recognize Chinese information warfare manipulation. They want more funds for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to increase our allies and partners' military preparedness in the Pacific. So it's quite a comprehensive piece of legislation. And I noticed one of the key Republicans, Chairman Jim Risch of Idaho, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he praised it. He didn't dump on it and say, this is terrible, Democrats are idiots. He praised it and said this could become the basis of bipartisan cooperation. Another data point was in January in Munich, when after both Mark Esper and Mike Pompeo made their speeches on China, mainly on China, Nancy Pelosi gave her speech. And a stunned reporter asked Nancy Pelosi, it sounds like you're agreeing with the Trump administration on China policy. And she basically said, yes. So there seems to be a trend in the direction of bipartisan cooperation. But do you think this is just a moment which will not last? Or do you see some reason for optimism in bipartisan unity toward China? Because your speech tended to be very negative.
Here's what I know. I know that Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, for decades, have talked tough on China.
On trade issues.
On trade issues. But we never got anything really done. It's about walking the talk. And the difference between Donald J. Trump and everybody else who has preceded him, there's really 2 differences. One is he got here without being the tool of corporate America. He didn't need their money. and he was untethered from the ladder that most of these politicians go up from. So he has done what he thinks is best in the national interest, and the record speaks for itself. He stood up to China. But you mentioned, a think tank. I'm sure they do great work, and I'm heartened that they're sending some people out who are possibly going to be tough on China to talk to Joe Biden. But as long as you raise this issue, remember that the fish rots from the head up. Or the head down,
I'm not sure what
guess.
you mean.
And the problem here is if you look, for example, at a guy like Kurt Campbell back in the Obama administration, when Campbell worked with Hillary Clinton to engineer what? You know what I'm talking about?
Sure,
the pivot to Asia. Now, as a practical matter, what happened was, and we know this from recent news coming out of the so-called and alleged Biden crime family scandal, that Joe Biden was entrusted with executing the pivot strategy, including backing China, communist China, down from militarizing the South China Sea. And there was that famous event in the beautiful Rose Garden at the White House where the General Secretary, Xi Jinping, came there, shook Barack Obama's hand, shook Joe Biden's hand, promised that they would both stop hacking our computers and stop militarizing the South China Sea. Now, subsequent to that, Biden goes to China. He takes his kid with him. And when Joe Biden gets back, there's a reversal essentially on our policy of the pivot, where there's no follow through. We get nothing done on that. And Hunter's got $1 billion worth of money to go buy defense-related companies in Michigan for China and ship them over to China. So I take your point, but I think it's not parties that make policy and change, it's people. And what we need are people on both sides of the aisle in politics. But we also need, I can't stress this, the need to have people in journalism who are willing to see this bigger picture. I've been rereading Pat Buchanan's book on the Nixon administration and his experience there. And it was not unlike today, where you had a hostile media to the Nixon administration, you had protesters in the streets, you had these conflicts, to your question earlier, between the American people over issues that are of domestic politics. And that was a fight worth having, okay? And we could fight within the nation and not damage our American democracy. In fact, we strengthened it at that time. That's not what we're doing here. We're fighting in a way where the news media is just, to me, it's out of control. That puffball debate we had on one network with Joe Biden and the fastball hardballs that they had on the other with President Trump, to me, was like a microcosm of just how the playing field has been so distorted in a way which, again, we're losing sight of the fact that communist China wins. Every time the NBA shut up and dribbles, they win. Every time Silicon Valley takes a bunch of new Chinese cash for the IPO and lets the IP, the intellectual property, go over to China, we lose. And I fear for our democracy here. This is why I'm here. This place really is at the forefront
The Hudson Institute.
of thought
Okay.
about these matters, and it's time to have a national dialogue. Look, the American people get this, okay? If you look at the Pew poll, Pew does like honest work, right? And if you just look at the trajectory of the American people who think that China is a significant threat.
Continues to go
it's
up.
like a ski slope up in Vermont. It's just boom. And if you're in Michigan, or if you're in Wisconsin, or if you're in Pennsylvania, You've seen the Chinese come in and devastate, first, your factories and your jobs, and then next your communities with the opioids and fentanyl. People out there in America, this is not America, this is the swamp here, okay? But you go to the Iron Range in Duluth. You go to the Antrim Shale Formation in Michigan, where there's fracking employing 50,000 people. You go to the cranberry bogs in Wisconsin. You go to the Pride of Clyde in Ohio, where they make washing machines. You go to Pennsylvania in the Philly shipyard. Every one of those places has benefited from Trump economic policy in a way which never would have happened under the alternative. And those places are still having to fight back from the hole that Communist China dug them in by entering the WTO, the World Trade Organization, with the vote of people like Joe Biden and Bill Clinton and a bunch of Republicans. And it's time right now to have the epiphany that stuff's got to stop.
It seems to me that the Republican Party, for many decades, had a position of so-called free trade.
Yeah.
And it was almost like religious faith, that any single tariff.
It was faith.
It
was a praise the Lord faith.
But my impression is, and this is back to your Harvard economics PhD.
Yes.
My impression is all of this was.
I taught that Ricardian model. I know just how flawed it is.
This was all based on the economists.
Yes.
Who somehow believed it and found data to support it. So is it fair to say now that our economists have begun to change their views? And so that when they see a predatory, mercantilist China, they don't anymore say, well, gee, free trade will solve this problem, free trade and patience. Are economists now focusing more on the damage caused by a predatory, mercantilist state that's almost the same size as our GDP? Because it seems to me if economists sounded the warning, Nobel Prize winning economists, sounded the warning, maybe the New York Times and the Washington Post would follow because they'd be differential to Nobel Prize winning economists. This is your field.
Yeah, so
I'm not an economist.
Look, I think that there's at least a little bit more clear-eyed view of the hazards of free trade. I mean, free trade, the free trade model, the Ricardian model, it's like hundreds of years old based on a world that never even existed back then in terms of the model.
We always hear Adam Smith as the founder.
Adam Smith, David Ricardo, David Hume.
And you taught
comparative
this,
advantage.
You taught this at university courses.
It's like here's the thing. It's like in my profession, right? If there's 100 economists in a room, there's probably only like 3 or 4 of them who are actually trade economists, right? The rest of them learn trade a little bit as part of their training, and they have this ideological affinity for free trade, free markets, and all that. The complication in the world, of course, is that this country has the lowest tariffs in the world, the lowest non-tariff barriers in the world, and we get our clocks cleaned. And it manifests as a big trade deficit, which basically is a shorthand for all the jobs and factories that get shipped offshore. I mean, what sense is it for Europe to charge tariffs on autos 4 times higher than we do? What sense is it for India, I call them the Maharaja of tariffs, to have tariffs that are like triple digits on just product after product after product? But the bigger problem with China that I don't think my profession's ever going to be able to wrap their heads around is that with China, it's an issue far beyond trade, right? It's like when we were negotiating the deal with China, which they backed away from, right? It wasn't so much about trade, it was about those 7 deadly sins. The idea that they're stealing our intellectual property, which down the road means we'll be less prosperous, things like that. And then you add on to that these geopolitical and national security issues. Like, how do you deal? I mean, there's very few people in my profession who can wrap their heads around militarization in the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. And there's probably not a lot of them who think a lot about the loss of democracy in Hong Kong and what that might mean for civilization, much less the financial
or the Uyghurs.
Yeah, or the Uyghurs.
It's not an economic issue.
You know, so that's why the kind of stuff you write, Mike, is so important, because it gets out there this bigger context for what's going on here. But I mean, we'll, as the president likes to say, we'll see what happens. But the one thing I can tell you is that the world needs people like Donald Trump, because he's one of the few people who's willing to stand up to China. Mm-hmm. He's willing to do that. And as far as I can see, most of the alternatives are compromised. They either compromise or they don't see the big picture.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I should raise another issue that your speech causes some concern in my own thinking about the next 10 or 15 years. As we went into the Cold War, which I only read about in history books, I noticed that the United States under Harry Truman made a lot of changes in its institutions to deal with the Soviet Union and the Cold War. We created the CIA. By law, we created the National Security Council. We created the U.S. Air Force. A whole series of institutions were created to deal with the Soviet challenge or Soviet threat. And it was done quite consciously. Yeah. White House memos, and then legislation being passed, and then new organizations being set up that didn't exist before. Now, I've seen some proposals like that from the Congress. One I know you know about is Marco Rubio and others, lots of Democrats, supporting a technology czar in the White House, that we don't take protection of our technology seriously enough. Sure, Commerce Department has a role, Treasury has CFIUS, the intelligence community is looking for examples of technology theft. But until it really becomes an organization, often our government bureaucracy doesn't take something very seriously. Do you think we're in that kind of situation going forward, that we're going to have to think about new institutions that focus on China? Or can the current swamp?
This reminds me of Joe Biden on the campaign trail saying he's going to form an office of trade and manufacturing, and I go, oh, did that 4 years ago. But we have the Office of Technology Policy at the White House, run by an extremely capable guy in Michael Kratsios. Look,
I know him.
You talk about Marco Rubio, it's like he's doing great stuff. Rubio's doing great stuff. Josh Hawley's doing great stuff. Tom Cotton's doing great stuff. Schumer's making kind of the right noises. Mm-hmm. But here's the problem. It's like the House of Representatives turns Democrat in 2018. Mm-hmm. And they spend 2 years doing what? No legislation, just these like crazy investigations that went nowhere for all just partisan purposes, and they dragged American society and political system into the muck. My point here, again, getting back to the theme of the speech, is that these useful idiots have to understand that there actually are important problems in the world which we have to unify politically against. And if we don't do that, so for me it's like people make policy, okay? And you can put all the institutions wrapped around this and make change, whatever. But until people on Capitol Hill are willing to do what's necessary in order to address the China threat, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And until the media turns away from spin, partisanship, and being like a super PAC for the Democrat Party, and turns back to Deng Xiaoping. I hate to quote a Chinese communist, but it'd be nice for them to seek truth from facts for a change.
Let me ask you the last question, which is maybe one you don't want to answer, but you raised it in your remarks, and I think it's the most important thing right now about China. You mentioned the need to hold China accountable for the virus.
Yes.
The president himself has mentioned several times, usually in the future tense, that China will be held accountable in the future. In other words, the steps he's taken in the last 6 or 8 months are not holding China accountable. Do you have any concept
For the virus,
for the virus?
Yeah.
Do you have any concept of where the president could go in terms of holding China accountable for the virus? The one example I've seen so far in terms of co-sponsors in the Senate, Martha Blackburn, Josh Hawley, quite a few have supported it, is the idea of being able to sue the Chinese government using Libya and the Pan Am bombing as the precedent. Yeah. That for $10 million per human life, you take that times, so far, 200,000 for us, 1 million for the whole world. This becomes the bill. This becomes how to hold China accountable. They owe the world for the death of 1 million people, and they have to somehow pay for it. Is that the right way to think about it, or is it still just not known?
So as an economist, let me
Yes.
just quickly do the numbers
Please.
for you.
I defer to you as an economist.
One of the macabre things that the government does is value a human life, and the price is $10 million. Now, life is priceless, okay? But if you simply take that number and the over 200,000 Americans we've lost, it's a couple $1 trillion. Add that, the trillions of dollars that have been spent in the Phase 1 deal, and through monetary policy, probably gets you up to 8 or 10 trillion. And then you go and you model all of the economic costs of the downturn, the unemployment, the human suffering, and all of that.
Opioid addiction.
I would say that the cost that the Chinese Communist Party has inflicted on America is approaching the loss of a full year of American GDP. Okay?
That's 20 trillion.
Now, I tell you two things. The American people believe, rightly, that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this virus, and polls show that they want them held accountable. If we are in a Jeffersonian democracy, that should get the attention of both sides of the aisle, and that's going to be a decision that I think is going to get made at some point. It's great to be with you here today, sir.
Thank you for coming to
I appreciate the Hudson Institute for having me. I have great admiration for you and this institute.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming.